Nurrideen School for Girls. She was a slim woman. Her long-sleeved garment was loose-fitting, revealing a slight swelling of her bosom. Layers of fabric confined her limbs, a black headscarf tied around her head, the folds rippling at her neck. It was unsettling. Her face and the skin of her hands were the only parts of her body he could see. Her eyes were brown as hazelnuts, boring into him, her terror reflected in each like pools of water. Tears streamed down her face, and she continuously wiped them away with her sleeve. She fought to keep her composure, though she didn't make a sound, not a whimper. "What are you doing in here?" he asked the Muslim woman. It seemed unlikely to him that she'd chosen this place to hide. The first floor exit was only a few feet away. She could have easily pushed through the doors as soon as she heard the gunfire, joining the others who were safely outside. She must have been occupying this space before he entered the building. Perhaps he'd just missed her when he rounded the corner. "I... nothing," she stammered. He could see her working out her answer, gauging his reaction. She glanced at a small green rug on the floor, a pair of leather mules stacked neatly beside it. "I was praying." With his rifle, he gestured for her to sit down on the solitary chair. She hesitated for a moment, glancing again at her shoes. When she settled onto the cushion, she gripped the armrests, her torso straight and rigid. The lower half of her body trembled, and her chin quivered. She was completely attentive. He studied the space, a table with a gold-embossed book, no other furniture. On the ceiling, he followed a metal track running from one side to the other, splitting the room in half. He imagined a curtain had once hung down, separating the priest from the confessor. He'd hated going to confession when he was a kid. His mother dragged him and his brother Joey every Thursday evening while their father waited in his pickup truck outside of St. Matthew's. He and his brother sat stiffly on a wooden bench across from the confessional, their mother inside. He'd wondered what she could possibly be confessing. She worked hard to make them a home, and what did she get in return? A man who seemed to despise the world. Why wasn't his father in there confessing his sins? His own transgressions were relatively minor, cursing at Joe, drinking an extra bottle of rationed milk. He'd never confessed to immoral thoughts of harming his father or masturbating in the shower. While they waited their turn, he and Joe made funny faces at each other, each challenging the other to laugh first and break the somber quiet of the church. Behind them in the lonely pews, old women wearing short lace veils murmured prayers on their knees, rosaries tucked between their folded hands. He couldn't tell anything about this Muslim woman behind her watery eyes and quivering chin. Her folded olive-skinned hands trembled in her lap, and he studied a solid gold wedding band that she rubbed with her forefinger. He and Eileen never talked about marriage, easing into a life of cohabitation that resembled something like love, a close and simple companionship. The first time they had sex, he traced a finger over a thin and long scar on her thigh, like a stroke from a fine-tipped brush. "Lover's quarrel," she snorted. She lay flat on her back, her arm across her chest, and told him about her abusive ex-boyfriend who'd beaten her so badly she was in the hospital for a week. She'd lost her job as a secretary and for a long while waitressed until she could find something better. "You got kids?" he asked the woman. "Yes, 2 boys and a girl." She hadn't taken her eyes off the rifle. Had she looked at him closely? If, in a miracle, she'd make it out alive, could she identify him? He'd been invisible his whole life. Today, that would change forever. He leaned against the door, his rifle still trained on her. He was suddenly exhausted, but remained alert. "My daughter attends here." She paused. "She's a senior. Her name's as—" "Shut up! You think I'll feel sorry for you if you tell me their names?" You're ruining this country, your people, your evil religion. He remembered that day. He was at home in the morning. He'd been assigned second shift at his heating and cooling job. All alone, he watched a raw video of two planes colliding into 200,000 tons of steel. It was surreal, like a sci fi invasion, unlike anything that could plausibly happen in this country, the most powerful nation in the world. Newscasters cut into the footage to report what they knew so far. President Bush had been reading to a bunch of second graders in Florida when the first plane hit. Eileen called him from the restaurant. "Holy Christ," she whispered into the phone. He could hear her coworkers sobbing in the background. It was all anyone talked about in his online chat groups, the 9/11 terrorists. Members declared positions that were as sound as an overhaul of pilot licensing and as extreme as corralling all the Muslims until the government could get to the bottom of the attack. Quit looking for one mastermind. Every Muslim is an enemy of the state. Now will you take away my right to bear arms? Fuck Dems and liberals and political correctness. A holy war has begun. He'd had no direct interactions with Muslims, though he'd suddenly seemed surrounded by them in Tempest when he moved from Chicago. They'd been in line in front of him at Walmart, their kids pulling candy bars off the checkout shelf despite their mother's admonishment, or they'd be stopped at a traffic light beside him, women in headscarves perched behind the steering wheels of their luxury SUVs. He'd started carrying a gun outside of the range, as times were increasingly dangerous according to the men at his shooting clubs and from what he'd been reading online. He'd started stowing a small handgun in the glove compartment of his car, keenly aware of it when he walked across a parking lot in a shopping mall and passed black teenagers hooting and hollering at each other. The more he delved into the internet, the more alarmist the sites became, gripping him to his desk chair in the front room while Eileen knitted and watched the Wheel of Fortune. Every blog transmitted information like an oracle proffering omens of a soon-to-be destroyed society if his race did not rise up against every visible adversary. There was little sense of hope, only a resounding call to battle. Afterward, he'd be in a terrible mood, Eileen wondering what had overcome him when she'd come home from her shift at the IHOP. "The hell's gotten into you?" she'd say as he slammed kitchen cabinets. "It's that crap you're reading on the computer, isn't it?" "Never mind," he'd tell her, grabbing Jenny's leash for a brisk walk to shake off his rage. He'd cut through the park across from the Willowwood apartments, children gleefully shrieking as they barreled down slides and bounced on seesaws. Now, over a decade since 9/11 and the cataclysmic failure of the Obama administration, the most popular topic was still Islam. "Will you submit to Sharia law?" And thousands of users left comments detailing incidents where they'd clashed with mussies and hajis. One member had reported almost strangling a woman with her own headscarf. "Makes it easier to lynch these Quran-thumping whores. They supply the noose." When the body of a little boy washed up on a Mediterranean shore, he'd felt numb. Eileen had covered her mouth in horror as she watched the news report. He'd already seen it on his Facebook feed. "Wish they'd all drown, like the Red Sea purging the Egyptians." He studied the woman in front of him. He remembered the village hall meetings he'd attended, smoldering in his chair as a brown-skinned lawyer argued before the board to reopen the convent, make it a school for Muslim boys. He'd volunteered to pass out flyers at local grocery stores and the public library protesting the project. The woman looked back, shifting her gaze from his rifle to his face. "I'm sorry for your pain," she said quietly. "We can talk about it." The sirens wailed. How much time had passed since he'd entered the building? The only shard of natural light came from beneath the door. The light bulb cast a shadow of the woman's head, the shape of a cave in a distant mountain. "What do you know about it?" he sneered. "You don't care a goddamn bit about me or this country. You don't belong here." "I was born in this country, just like you," she said, leaning forward, her hands fluttering like birds in her lap. "Yeah? You sure don't fucking act like it." He shook his head vehemently. "Nah, lady, you don't belong here at all." And he believed it now. It was a message that suddenly resounded louder than all the times he'd heard it or read it online over the years. They don't belong here. Like most true citizens, he'd perceived them as mere outsiders, a nuisance. But everything changed on 9/11. Now they were killing innocent citizens with their suicide missions, believing their Allah would gift them with virgins in paradise. On that fatal morning, he clocked in at work and headed toward the break room to store his lunch when the planes crashed into the World Trade Center. "I'm not your enemy," the woman suddenly blurted. She shifted in her chair, and he instinctively raised his rifle chest high again. "Yes, you are," he responded. She happened to be one kind of enemy he'd encountered up close.